In this lesson, I want to discuss the difference between the northern and southern states. Now, this is a term that historians often talk about when discussing the American Civil War. However, it is also true that already by 1778, there were key differences between the northern and southern states, and certainly Britain perceived these differences and hoped to exploit them. There's a certain logic to how these states developed that explains why they were different. The southern states were created as economic ventures, meaning colonies whose job was to create wealth for Britain. So most of those colonies had an economic incentive to raise what were called cash crops. Now, these are crops that you cannot actually live on, such as cotton or tobacco, but you can grow them, and then they will produce a great deal of cash when you sell them on the market. These kinds of crops, however, are labor intensive. They require huge tracts of land and a great deal of unskilled labor. The only people who could really afford huge tracts of land at this time were people who were somewhat closely associated with the noble families back in Britain. The economy of the southern colonies then was based on slave labor, large quantities of slave labor, and these cash crops. Now, the North was significantly different. In the northern colonies, most of these were established because people were moving away from Britain voluntarily. They were wanting to create a different kind of society. Quakers in Pennsylvania, or Congregationalists in Massachusetts, for example. There was not so strong of an economic incentive in those colonies to produce wealth for Britain. Instead, most of those colonies wanted to simply be productive and able to sustain themselves. So there was a great variety of economic options in the northern colonies. Also, land was smaller. There was a lot more mountains and regions like this, so farms were not as large. Plantations were not common at all in the north. Now, there were still slaves, but the slaves tended to be far more skilled. The economic incentive of those northern colonies focused on interdependence, and therefore there were fisheries, seafaring areas, small farms, lumber mills, and various forms of crafts, and the slaves in the north would be involved in all of that. So if we were to look at the North and the South, we see some significant differences. The South is far more rural, with vast distances between the different towns and cities. In the North, the cities are much more dense, they're heavily connected, and people are heavily connected with their village. There's more interdependence in the North and more independence in the South. The South is also favors the Church of England at this time, whereas the North favors Congregationalists, Quakers, and Baptists, and a wide diversity in religion. The South has fewer cities and fewer schools, while the North has the largest cities and some of the earliest schools of the United States. And the South, because of those wealthy families, has greater ties to Britain. And the North, because they had always sought independence of some form, have weaker ties to Britain. So Britain's aware of this. They know that the South has greater ties. The South also has far larger numbers of slaves. Now, at this time, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, although there were far more of them in the southern states than in the northern. The northern states, so the New England and the middle colonies, had around 2 to 3% of their population as slaves, whereas in the southern states, 40% of the population in Virginia was enslaved, and 60% of the population in South Carolina. There were about 500,000 slaves in the 13 states at this time. Most of them were in the South. Now, we have already seen that the British sought to exploit slavery when Governor Dunmore of Virginia issued an Emancipation Proclamation in 1775. Now, that was only for slaves in Virginia. However, in 1779, the British released a colony-wide Emancipation Proclamation for any slave who joined the British side. What's interesting is that in the same year that Governor Dunmore issued his Emancipation Proclamation, there was a Philadelphia man named Anthony Benson. He was a Frenchman and a Quaker, and he founded the first abolitionist society. So right at the time of the Revolution, some Northerners were thinking about abolition of slavery. Benjamin Franklin would become the first president of that society in 1787. And also, during the Revolution, many northern states began to really think about abolishing slavery. Most of them realized that to just suddenly abolish it would cause all kinds of economic turmoil. So most of them chose to do what was called a gradual abolition. What that meant was no new slaves could come into those states. Any children who were born of slaves were automatically free. And if a owner of a slave did not register the slave every year, then the slave was free as well. And in this way, those northern states began to radically reduce the number of slaves in their states. So the American Revolution is sort of like a fork in the road. It's a new time. A new republic is being built, and there's an opportunity. The northern states choose to take one path, which is the gradual abolition of slavery. The southern states choose a different path, which is to increase their economic dependence on the institution of slavery. Now, the purpose for my lesson today was for us to realize that there were differences between the northern and southern states already in 1778, that the key differences were the number of loyalists and the number of slaves. But all the states had slaves and loyalists. They weren't exactly equal, however, and Britain chose to exploit what was happening in the South.